So the first thing that I'd like to do is to recognize my co-PIs on this. That is Dave Thomas, who continues to work with the fire community, particularly looking at high reliability and performance. He retired from the Forest Service a number of years ago. Jennifer Ziegler is at Valparaiso University. She's a professor of communications. And Jim Saveland is the program manager of the Human Factors and Risk Management RDNA. Primary funding for this project comes from Joint Fire Science. The Human Factors and Risk Management RDNA is sponsored jointly by Fire and Aviation Management of the Forest Service and the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Now what I'd like to do today is just give you a brief overview of the project itself, from objectives, methods, who participated, take a look at the results, focusing on those that are resulting in recommendations, what I call actionable things that you all can do concretely on the ground, and illustrate those key themes with some of the narrative itself. And then in the last third, what I want to do is bring that back and talk about how we can think about and use those results to improve learning, actually learning throughout all of our organizations in fire, in prescribed fire, or throughout. My goal is to actually take about 40 to 45 minutes to do that so that we have a good bit of time for discussion at the end. So I'm going to be moving through material quickly and be happy to come back to any of it at the end during discussion. So what we set out to do with this project was two things. One, we really wanted to investigate existing learning, and we were obviously looking in the context of prescribed fire, and particularly at what we learned through reviewing those burns, particularly those that escape. The reason that we were doing this was to try to figure out how to improve organizational learning. So we're looking at existing, but we're also looking at trying to figure out what we would need to tweak in order to improve that learning. We wanted to go directly to the people who have been involved in reviews, the reviewers, the line officers, the land managers, the units, the individuals who were involved, and have an extended conversation with them. So what we did is we designed 2-day workshops in 5 different locations across the country. We held those the first part of last year. We wanted to have an in-depth discussion with these groups. So we were shooting for anywhere between 6 and 25 people. We wanted a range of responsibilities, from those folks who are out on the ground to those who have more managerial and oversight responsibilities. And we wanted to have a range of different agencies to really have a rich mixture and a rich dialogue. The workshop flow, day 1, we were really trying to understand learning quite broadly, mostly through use of personal stories of insight and action, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. The second day, we were really looking at review processes, the products of those reviews, and how lessons were transferred from that event and from that review, and in particular looking what is facilitating learning and what are the barriers to learning that currently exist that we might want to look at removing or minimizing. We wanted to take a really broad perspective on learning, recognizing that it may well be the case that most learning happens during the event itself, and then to separate out what is happening during the review process itself, what is happening as a result of the product, and look at transfer activities. And similarly, we recognize that there are a variety of different actors who would be the target of this learning, from the individual all the way through the burn team to peers and other units in the organization. And finally, we wanted to recognize that moving a lesson into action is actually 2 parts. The first is that aha or that insight where we go, oh yeah, that's how things work, or wow, I really should have done that differently next time, or I should have done that differently, I want to do that differently next time. And that moving into action is when we actually incorporate that new behavior into our actual practice. Because we wanted to see, and we suspect, that there is a fair amount of lag time between that moment of aha and the ability to consistently bring it into practice. And if we ignore the insight, we might be ignoring some of the most powerful ways to improve learning. Finally, we wanted to set up a tone and a space to have a particular type of conversation. And this diagram just shows the 4 general types of conversations that can occur. There's nothing wrong with any of them. They're appropriate. For instance, right now, we're all in a monologue format here. And that the goal is generally information exchange. When you get over to the box, I guess I have a pointer, don't I? Over here, multiple monologues. That's when you're ramping it up. The goal is to essentially persuade somebody to a particular perspective. So you're speaking to persuade. In the upper side, the upper half, this dialogue box, what we're doing is really focusing on learning. So you're stepping away from your own perspective in the sense that you're making it known, but then you're also wanting to really understand where the other person is coming from. And this is particularly good when and useful when you are trying to understand how a complex system looks, feels, and acts. I think of mutual learning as sort of the whole is the sum of the parts, where when you're successful, you come out really understanding everybody's perspective. And this other generative learning is where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, where you're really beginning to think together. We wanted to have these conversations in this upper box and pay attention to how these showed up in reviews and were implicated, I guess, or affected different review processes. Okay, so just briefly here, who showed up? We had a total of 67 people show up across these 5 different workshops. As you can see, this pie chart breakdown, about 45% were from the district level, about 28% were from the forest, refuge, or park level, and we had about 18% region state and 9% national. So we got a nice mix there. Similarly, we got a nice mix across agencies. National Forest Service has more people in the U.S. than these other agencies, and I think it's probably intuitive that we would get the bulk of our participants were from there. You can see that's National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs and Tribes, and then other. And these other were from the 3 organizations that are interagency in the U.S., the Fire Use Training Academy, Prescribed Fire Training Center, and Lessons Learned Center. AD refers to those federal employees who come back to us as retirees. Excuse me, let me go back a moment here. There we go. And then we had a couple from the NGO TNC. In terms of participants, we got a nice range of positions represented. At the district level, we had a couple of line officers. We had quite a few people in the fuel specialist and FMO roles. We also got some folks who work very specifically and directly on the ground, engine captains, some seasonal folks, wildfire modules, etc. At the park and refuge level, burn boss, staff officers, fuels planners, FMOs, regional level, and these, of course, some of these people would have been line officers earlier in their careers. So we got, again, a nice perspective and range of perspectives from the region and the state office level as well. Finally, we wanted to understand what people's experience had been with escape prescribed fire reviews. And you can see here that over 50% of them had either been the subject of an escape prescribed fire review or a member of a review team. A third of them had actually been on both sides of it. We have in here a couple who had actually been the line officer accountable for a review, and we had some who had no experience. So we're thinking that we're getting a full spectrum of experience. those who can really tell us what works and what doesn't, all the way from learning during the review process to transfer. Okay, so data analysis and methods. Excuse me. We captured our data in a variety of different ways. One of our team, Jennifer Ziegler, took very detailed notes during the workshop, and at the end of those 2 days, the group summarized and captured on flip charts what they thought were the most important pieces of that 2-day conversation. We also recorded all of those. The first two, the workshop notes and flip chart summaries, were compiled, and we produced a workshop summary and a flip chart summary. Those are on or available on our Joint Fire Science page, and if you haven't received them, those are available, and you can contact me to get them. The audio recordings, those were transcribed. We did all the quality assurance, quality control, and are using a narrative analysis program called In Vivo to really get down into the rich detail in those transcriptions. We're looking at this in 2 different ways. One is to really look at an application-oriented set of products, and that will come out in the general technical report, and as a series of podcasts looking at tips and techniques. We're also going to be doing some peer-reviewed papers and some conference presentations, and that will take more of a theoretical approach. And in a parallel manner, when we're going through our analysis, we're looking at this in 2 different ways. The first is what I would call instrumental, which is looking at what was actually said. We'll synthesize and describe, when, how, who, why. There were barriers and facilitators to learning within this arena, and also the recommendations. The second way we're looking at this is sort of to step back and look at how things were said and why things were said. And here we're going to be drawing on theory as our lens for looking at this data. And we're using this area of high-performance theory, resiliency, learning, organizational learning theory, and communications, looking at rhetoric and dialogue. And so you'll see I'll be looking through both of these lenses through the remainder of this talk. I want to talk about 3 main themes that these results sort of bucket themselves into. One has to do with policy and guidance, another with conducting a review, and the third on transferring and institutionalizing lessons learned during the review process. Now, what I'm going to do first is show some specific quotes, but what I want you all to know is that these illustrate points that were made consistently across the workshops, across levels of the hierarchy, and across agencies. So let's look first at where learning is occurring. And as you might expect, there's a tremendous amount of learning that happens in the moment during the event, mostly on the part of the individual and on the burn team. When you move across that dotted line to the right and you look at the review process, the product, and the transfer activities, you don't see as much. And I'll note that this is a qualitative assessment here, sort of broad brush strokes. But in general, what we found is that the learning from the review process, some of it is there, but certainly there's a big desire to be more effective and more efficient at doing that. So what I want to do is drill down into this to look at sort of who and how and why. So there's a lot of words here, and I'm going to read them to you. The reason that I chose this quote is because it captures very well a number of the key themes. So this person who happens to work with Fish and Wildlife Service at a regional level says, I get a little confused because we keep talking about learning, and I'd ask, who's supposed to be learning what? Because there's all these different levels. There's the burn boss, there's the holding boss, there's a guy in the nozzle that could very well be learning something from it, and how they're going to learn is going to depend a lot on where it's presented and how it's presented. Agency administrators want to learn something else. Policymakers might want to learn something else. So it's kind of like we take this thing, we make a document out of it, put it on the website, and all of a sudden, presto, it's going to meet all of these different learning needs. It doesn't seem like that's possible. It seems like it's missing all of the boats by trying to get all of them at once. So the key themes here is there's a lot of confusion out there about what is the purpose of the reviews and what's the intent, who's supposed to be learning what. There's recognition that there are a variety of different audiences and that how you all learn is going to depend a lot not only on what position you're sitting in the organization, but how that information is presented to you and where it's presented. So we're starting to talk about, transfer mechanisms. Putting it on a website, that's great, but that's really passive. That's likely not going to get to the sort of transfer that we really want and need. It's part of the equation, but it's not the whole equation. And this recognition that a single document is probably unlikely to meet the needs of all of these different audiences. Another major theme that we heard was about the emotional impact of reviews on all people. Now, this quote here actually has is with respect to a review report that never got released. And believe me, we heard a lot about the impact of reports that are not released. And in general, the 2 points here is that what they're recognizing is that for people to get closure, for the healing process to begin internally and with your partners, having that report physically out there is really key. And also that losing a burn and the review itself takes a mental, physical, and emotional toll on everybody, from the burn boss to the lighter to the line officer and to the fire staff. So those are some real big themes out there. Want to talk a little bit more about the audience, because we were able to identify very clearly some different expectations and some different needs. And I think this helps us start to begin to move towards some actionable fixes, because it really helps articulate what it is that each group needs. So at the national level, they're really looking for corrective action, particularly with respect to policy. Do the findings and recommendations suggest there needs to be a change in policy? That's really different than what we heard from the folks on the ground, who had a couple of different things they were looking for. In this first quote, they're looking for tips to help them improve their job. So this person said, I was pretty disappointed with the report. And this screen, let me see. My apologies, I had to make that go away for a moment. I was looking at the review team as kind of the experts to come in and tell me, well, these are the tricks of the trade or whatever. That didn't happen. The report was written to teach other people what happened on the unit. It wasn't written to teach us how to be better. And these are two themes that also came up quite frequently. One, that the local unit wasn't learning either from the review team itself or from the product of that review. Another way that the ground really wants to learn is from the product, is looking for information that can be immediately and fairly quickly turned into exercises, like a sand table exercise, to help them train and coach their folks. It's particularly important that those come from the actual players or have some sort of a bullet list that you can quickly move through and integrate and build off of. Another way that we heard across all of these workshops is the story, how important that story is, so that the peers can hear from another what the decision-making process was leading up to the ignition of that burn and then following all the way through to the review. So that's pretty different than what the national office is looking for. The regional office is looking for something slightly different. Due diligence or corrective actions at the local level. So in this case, this person is recognizing that at the regional level, they need to meet policy. And right now the policy says numbers 1 through 7 is what they need to get, and until that would change, that's what they're going to be needing and looking for in a review. The other thing that we heard from regional folks, and this is attributed to somebody in the U.S. Forest Service, but we did hear this again from all the agencies, is that at the regional level, there is a real desire to be able to have sufficient consistency across reviews that they can pick up themes, common threads that are coming out of reviews, so that they can quickly identify whether their program is vulnerable to some facet of fire behavior or burn organization, and to be able to integrate that into future planning and application. So how to improve learning? Now, many of these quotes here actually are looking forward to how to improve things, but believe me, the exact opposite is true. For every one of these things, what are the barriers to learning is in there as well. So for instance, under how to improve the review itself, there's an intense desire to clarify the intent. And here this person says, do we have the objective of reviewing policy and checking the 7 steps, or do we have an objective to facilitate a learning culture within our organization? So unclear intent is one of the key barriers to learning currently. Another aspect here, about half of the people were thinking of this as an either-or situation. Through the workshop and among about the other half of the folks, everyone kind of came to this conclusion or tentative conclusion that perhaps it's not an either-or. We can have both. We can review policy and check our behavior, and we can learn. But if that's in fact the case, we need to be very deliberate about that. Part of doing that is having very clear, collaborative, comprehensive, and transparent direction. So oftentimes this is focused on the delegation of authority, but obviously there are lots of side conversations through which this can be clarified. Make sure that the direction for the review team covers who the audience is, what the purpose of the review is, how it's to be conducted, what the products are, and have this be transparent. In fact, you might want to start, the line officer might want to start by having a conversation with a local unit about what kind of review would be the most supportive of improving performance for the future. In terms of review team composition, a lot of discussion on this, how to staff a review team appropriately, because how a team runs a review, the attitude they go into it with, and what they think they're trying to do has a tremendous impact on the outcome of that process and the product. Pay attention to transfer. So what we heard loud and clear was that unless people can create a personal connection to the event, to the story, they're not as likely to be able to extract lessons out of it. Here's somebody who said, if I can create a personal connection, it has a lot more relevance, and I'm likely to learn those lessons, rather than if it's another dry report or even a video interview. Person-to-person, in-person communication is huge. And develop transfer mechanisms. As somebody recognized, there really isn't a defined mechanism for getting the lessons learned on escape prescribed fires out, or even the review reports. Yes, people post them on Lessons Learned Center, but they're often not widely spread around. And finally, follow up. Make sure those corrective actions happen. So to briefly summarize these themes that I've pulled out here today, on the policy and guidance, there's general confusion about types of reviews, purpose and intent, flexibility, whether one agency has flexibility or not, what the outcome should be. There's general agreement that currently when pursuing these 7 elements, which is what the policy currently requires, they may be useful for the Washington office or some level, but they're not meeting the field's desires, particularly that unit's desires to learn from the event. Some of that may be due to perceived intent of reviews that try to capture these 7 elements, as opposed to what those specific elements are. And that gets a lot to tone and behavior and intent, not as much sort of on the policy. There's a general desire for more flexibility, scalability, using a similar process to allow people to review all types of outcomes, not just the ugly ones or the bad ones, but the good ones, the surprises that are good surprises, as well as those surprises that are not the ones you want to see out there. there's a general desire for learning orientation, again, focused on the unit itself, and this desire, the ability to trend. So all of those are kind of in the policy and guidance arena. In terms of conducting a review, there's several critical pieces of a successful review. One of the keys is that line officer intent and direction to the review team and with their own unit. Clarity and transparency. No surprises. Everybody knows what's expected. Everybody stays to that. Approach matters. The review team, how they approach that group, whether they are asking 101 questions or sitting back and listening, that tone, that approach makes a huge difference. So that has implications for how we think about training, potentially training review team members, what sorts of skills we want to have on those review teams. And then finally, meet local culture where it is in terms of their learning orientation. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. What this recognizes, though, is that some units are open for learning and others are more closed and defensive. And this obviously connects with the approach of the review team. And there needs to be alignment there. Transfer and institutionalizing lessons. There's just a broad desire for more effective, coordinated transfer mechanisms and more attention paid to, okay, now we've noted these lessons. We've had the insights. How do we move them into practice consistently? So what I'd like to do is now in this last bit, talk about how we make sense of this sort of these results and this sort of data. And what I mean is, how do we think about, or what's our theory of performance, safety, and reliability? And this hopefully is somewhat familiar to some of you, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use 3 models that my co-investigator, Jim Savelin, has been incorporating into his webinars and his work. And I believe a month or so ago, he incorporated into one of his webinars. What I'm going to do is use these results that we found through our 10 days of talking and show how they can further build these models, as well as help us bring or pull implications for how we go about improving learning from them. So these 3 models are: how do we respond to or seek to improve our outcomes? How do we think about action and learning? And how do we build resilience to stress at individual and organizational levels? So the first one, this is probably a fairly familiar graphic for some. There's a spectrum of performance enhancement, I should say, and safety uses this quite a bit, from compliance to learning. And the concept is that if you have a rules-based system, that can bring your organization to a fairly high and consistent level of performance. But what management scientists have noted over the last decade or so is that if you want to move on from there, you want to vector towards learning, towards improvement-based. Now, there's a number of different characteristics of these organizations and these modes of thinking that I just want to talk about, because I think they help us understand where different parts of ourselves, our units, and our organizations are. So in the compliance-based or rules-based mode, most often the only kinds of outcomes that are really paid attention to are errors. And errors are thought of as something went wrong technologically or a human, and so they tend to result in blame. And you try to fix the person or you try to fix the technology. Managers view their roles as enforcing those rules, and conflict in these situations is unresolved or is competitive. So think back to that 4-box diagram, the lower right-hand side, where sort of that debate mode, which is there's one perspective that wins. So in a rules-based system, there is only one truth, and somebody is going to claim it. The other end of the spectrum, the learning or improvement-based systems, Outcomes are seen as opportunities for learning and understanding performance in all of its varieties. Managers, interestingly enough, they see their role as coaching, as being a coach, and as supporting collaboration among their supervisees and their team. Conflict in this mode is looked at as a way to understand different perspectives, and a resolution for conflict is sought that recognizes those and is resolved to the mutual benefit of all. Interestingly enough, I find, particularly for the Forest Service going through a lot of this safety journey, is what is in the middle here is a risk or a goal-based perspective on how to improve and maintain good outcomes. And in the risk-based system, outcomes that are not as desirable result in more controls. And managers use techniques like management by objectives or targets to help achieve and improve outcomes. And conflict in this mode is just sort of discouraged. We find evidence, and I think you guys can probably think of people and organizations throughout the fire community that fit in all of these. And remember, none of this is bad or wrong. It's just that there's this recognition that compliance can only get you so far. And then you want to be moving towards this right-hand side, towards the learning side. Okay, action learning. Another diagram that you're probably pretty familiar with, the OODA loop. Many of our models have this basic system where you prepare, you conduct, and you reflect. System 1, System 2 is just recognizing that the human brain has two modes that work together all the time. It's just that depending upon the cognitive task, one is dominant. So in the prepare and in the reflect, this is System 2, which is more analytic. It's slower, it's deliberate. We tend to share this sort of knowledge and oftentimes think aloud or think in a way that can be communicated. System 1 is what we think of as naturalistic decision making. This is the intuitive mode. Learning actually links all of these and closes that loop. So when we think about this, just to slow down a moment and think about this in terms of our tasks and say prescribed fire, when we're in this prepare phase, we're looking at designing and planning. We're taking a broad systems perspective. Success is really dependent on having a clear leader's intent and clear goals. We need good information in our assessments, and we use techniques such as visualization, controlled experiments, and deliberate practice to help us prepare for the activity. When we get into this conduct mode, into the task itself, we're basing our actions on expertise and intuition. We're using surprise. Success or high performance here is based on the degree to which we're able to quickly improvise, our knowledge of ourselves, and being able to draw on what all of our senses, including our emotions, are telling us, and being able to bring that into our practice. Reflection, we're back to that systems perspective. We're looking at assessing and reporting on what happened in here or in this whole loop to date. What we're looking for is a consistent and flexible process that's scaled so that we can look at both the good and the bad outcomes. To do this, it requires a lot of understanding, non-defensive interactions, openness, and trust among the participants. The learning side, the sorts of activities that we're doing, subjectively we're journaling to try to note down what it was that we saw. Objectively, we're looking and asking questions and trying to compile what actually happened. Fire effects monitoring, things like that. We're building that into stories that we tell ourselves, that we tell each other, that we transfer. We incorporate that into our own personal conduct, but we also are looking to transfer this organizationally and incorporate it and institutionalize it for the next loop. The final piece here is recognizing that sort of social or emotional intelligence does play a pretty important role in this whole loop. So on the left-hand side, we know that having confidence in yourself, in your own expertise, your ability to do something is critical. We know from crew resource management and others that other projects and theories, having confidence in your teammates and your workmates is also critical. We're starting to come into focus to recognize that the complement to the confidence is compassion for self and for other, and particularly when we get into the reflection and the learning. First thing that I wanted to say or suggest is that we already have within the fire community many activities that we do that help us with each one of these pieces. Now, maybe we could be more deliberate, maybe we could be more consistent or even coordinated about this. But in the preparation, we've got sand table exercises, before action reviews, pre-mortems, afterwards we have after action reviews, and then what I'm calling outcome reviews. Currently, obviously, they're mainly on negative outcomes, but there's the potential to have that expand to look at all outcomes. I'm going to suggest that what we do, and I think you all do very well, is during a task, is you make sense. The public sense making, all of those high reliability practices that you guys are doing as you are accomplishing your task is the primary way to think about action and learning in the moment. A couple of things that we noted here. Even though we have some organizations and some units incorporating lessons into refreshers, we have a lessons learned library, there's not as much out there yet to help move and transfer these lessons. And I think also we don't talk very much about follow-up or implementing recommendations. So those are two things. While we can really, I think, emphasize and build, recognize what we're doing and prioritize these, we may also want to be looking at how do we put more emphasis on these two pieces to really close this loop. The other piece on this emotional or social intelligence, I think the leadership courses that we have really done a good job on this confidence piece. This is starting to come into focus where we recognize that in order to really listen and learn, you have to move out of a defensive mode. And the way that you do that is through compassion for yourself and for another. And I think a lot of the movements to stand in another's shoes, to try to understand what it looked like moving forward in time rather than hindsight, all of that comes into this box up here. Finally, the last model here is how do we think about building resiliency to stress? And this spectrum just recognizes that stress is part of life. In fact, a certain amount of stress helps us improve our performance. Most of us are in this normal range of function, but there are ends of the spectrum. And we have in society certain professional types who are specifically trained to help us move from normal range of function into elite function. Think of some of the military training, think of athletes, Olympic athletes, or professional teams. So we have professional coaches who help us move this way. When stress becomes too much and we start to slide back, our performance starts to become impaired, whether it's for just a moment or for longer. If it does happen for longer, we have licensed therapists to help us move back into the normal range of function. Well, the folks who look at this recognize that in the middle, the group in society that is most capable of helping to sustain and to improve function within this normal range is peer support and peer coaching. And we heard a lot about this, particularly from the ground folks who really wanted peers on review teams and wanted to hear from their peers to get their lessons. So just as a final summary and implications, the data from this project supports and adds detail to these models of learning and performance. And when we look at it collectively, it suggests several sorts of activities that we can pursue. And this is obviously at the abstract level, but I think we can pull a lot of very concrete activities from the data and even from our discussion that we're going to have in a moment. The first is vector towards learning on that compliance, risk, and learning spectrum. In particular, when you're looking at a review, understand where the line officer and where your unit sit on the spectrum, and think about trying to design a process or use a review process and pull together a review team who can help you move from wherever you are towards this learning mode. That's going to help. Enhance learning by closing the learning loop. Make sure that we continue to embed practices like pre-mortems and before-action reviews and sand table exercises into our practice. We look at becoming more skilled and more practiced at reviewing the events, but also, once we get that down, how are we going to transfer this? How do we move these lessons to our peers in other organizations and through time even on our own organization? And recognize that we can use members of our own community to help improve performance and build this resilience to stress by emphasizing coaching. And that obviously can go way beyond the review team, but particularly looking at building review teams that have peers on them. And with that, I am going to open it up for questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ann. That was really good. That was really interesting. I appreciate that. I want to go ahead. If you have a question, you can type it in, and we will read them out and get to them. There, depending on your control panel there on the side, you should have a chat box or a question box, and you can type them into either one of those, and that'll bring them to us and we can get them up. So, but first I want to point out a couple things. That the Lessons Learned Center has actually produced a publication on this topic as well, and Ann's research is mentioned within it, and it's on the homepage for the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. The publication is Two More Change. It's the winter 2012 edition, and that's a nice complement to this discussion as well. So go ahead and get your questions in. I'll start off with one myself, and that was just, you mentioned that sometimes these reviews aren't very accessible or aren't presented or written in a format that makes them as useful as they could be. Or do you have any suggestions for, you mentioned, has great ideas about how you could take this information and use it in coaching and training. But what about in the review process itself? Is there a way these could be organized or a way they could be formatted and presented to the wildland fire community that would improve how useful they are for learning?
Yeah, thanks. I'll talk about two things, and they may sound like they're conflicting, but I actually don't think that they are. There's a lot of talk and recognition that lengthy reports are almost impossible to get through from the practitioner's perspective on the ground. And so bullet lists that very succinctly note what the lessons learned are, an executive summary really helps. And the other thing is this gets to audience. So that's one thing, is making sure that it's easy to find the lessons learned and they're succinct and they're bulleted. They have to be in sufficient detail, though, that somebody who's not on that unit can make sense of them. And we actually heard this a lot from folks who had been trying to use FLAs, or facilitated learning analyses, which the Forest Service has begun to use as a way to facilitate learning on the unit. And one of the critiques that some people had of some of the FLAs is that the story is so unit specific and the lessons are so unit specific that they didn't make sense to people who were not on that unit. And so I guess the lesson that I take out of that is, maybe there's two sets of lessons learned, sort of like an AAR and a roll-up, trying to decide, okay, is this a lesson that is meaningful really only for our specific unit, or is this something that others might learn from it? And if it's in that latter category, maybe running it by somebody who is not familiar with the event to see if they could understand and see what that lesson is and how they might apply it.
Okay.
Did that help?
Yeah. Jennifer Ziegler wants to know if this is going to be presented at the Human Dimensions Conference, the one that was mentioned at the beginning of the webinar in Seattle in April.
Yes, it will be. We will actually have several different presentations. Jennifer is going to be giving a talk looking through the lens of rhetoric and communications. I'm going to be talking about some more of our specific findings, and then in a poster session we're going to have some more concrete tips and techniques or sort of recommendations from the perspective of the participants in those workshops. So what really works well.
Okay. Was there, when you were going through these reviews, did you find any examples of units or incidents that were used well in training? Are there some models out there floating around where people have taken these reviews and done what you would consider like an ideal job of transferring those lessons into their training?
I'm not so sure that I found one example that did a real ideal job all the way through. I mean, some of the practices that seemed really good were, a lot of people talked about the lecture circuit and how useful it was, both for the member of the burn team who was reviewed to go on the lecture circuit and meet other people and talk about their experiences, but then also from those folks who were sitting in those meetings or refresher courses to listen to one of their peers. That just seems like a really tremendously valuable way of transferring lessons that obviously in our budget climate and our travel cap restriction climate now is a challenge. So people were thinking about short videos that might be used to capture and post stories and lessons. A lot of times the reports are used to build sand table exercises or other sorts of exercises for burn boss refresher courses. That seems to be one of the key ways that that people who are not associated with a burn use a report. And when I talked about improving that portion of the learning loop, it's not that those things aren't happening. It's just that they tend to be very localized and sort of idiosyncratic. It's based on somebody who has an interest, not a recognized part of a person's job or their responsibility to help transfer those lessons. A lot of what we heard has implications for line officers, and I'm not sure how we get to that particular group of people. So there are a lot of opportunities for taking lessons and moving them out into practice. But the real biggie that works very well is turning them into sand table exercises and then talking about them and building an exercise around a review or an escape in some sort of annual refresher.
Okay. Reva Duncan asks, what interest have you gotten regarding this project from the WOFAM?
So this is Forest Service specific, I'm assuming.
I wasn't sure what WOFAM was, so I was going to get you.
Okay, so I'm assuming that it is the Washington Office of Fire and Aviation Management.
Okay, there we go.
That would be Forest Service. And from them specifically, not much, but then again, that doesn't particularly surprise me because the group of people who have been very interested have been members of NWCG, so the National Wildland Fire Coordination Group, which is interagency. The Fuels Management Committee has been very interested. Of course, they are going through a review of the prescribed fire guidelines, which includes the processes of review following an escape. I've talked with them several times, and I think they're very interested in incorporating what we learned from folks into the next revision. So maybe not so much on the WO side, but still at a national level, there's been a tremendous amount of interest.
Okay. The next question is from Frankie Romero. You mentioned that there are a variety of audiences that want to be spoken to directly: firefighters, fire managers, fuel specialists, local line officers, regional, national line and staff, etc. Yet a desire to have peers make up a review team. Is there a recommendation as to what approach to take? One team with multiple levels of the agency represented, or multiple reviews that each focus on a particular audience?
That's a great question. I think that we had some wonderful discussions about that. My impression is that those are exactly the sorts of conversations that the community is ready to jump into. We were not, we sort of gathered up what learning is occurring, what are the barriers and the facilitators, but we just got into some of those discussions. And I don't really think that, even a group as diverse and representative as we got is the group to really, and the only group to have that discussion. So what we did here, we heard people talk about, well, we should really think through what sort of training we want members of a review team to have. If we're trying to get to, the millennial generation, we need to have somebody on the team who knows how to reach the millennials. If we want to, in terms of transfer, so that you think of your audience and the skills you need and build them into your review team. So in terms of peers, you might have a peer, a burn boss. You might have a line officer, and some of this is going to sound very, very much like some of the review teams some of you have sat on, and I think that is the case. It's just not that it's consistent. So we talked about, really sitting down with the group of people who's going to go through the review and who wants to get stuff out of the review, and talk about what is the composition of this review team, what do we want to get out of it, and what kinds of people and what kinds of skills do we need. Some people said, well, maybe we should have an interagency, a couple of interagency teams sort of on the IMT mode, the incident management team mode, who would go through a training together, and then they would be available to go out and do reviews for some period of time. So the team would have actually had a chance to sort of form and to get on the same page with respect to how are we going to approach, what tone do we want to set, how are we going to do that, how are we going to do our product. So we had some of that. We had, and there were several different iterations of a standing team, down to just thinking more as a community about, all right, what are the social and emotional intelligence skills that we want to have on a review team? How do we make sure that maybe at least the leader has those? But it's a great question, and I feel like we just were able to scratch the surface in our workshops.
Okay. The next question is from Patrick Doyle. After talking with a couple of people who have lost prescribed burns and been the subject of an FLA, they both mentioned that the thought process that led up to them lighting the match was never really reflected in the review, that the review is specific to the facts. The story of how they got there and what they were thinking and what they knew is reduced in the report by the review process that is able to look back with 2020 hindsight and discuss all the existing factors, losing that thought process in illustrating the facts. So my question is, are there plans to try to capture these thoughts, processes, the burn boss, the firing boss, holding bosses, or any other persons who are the thoughts of those people who are a critical part of the event/incident in current or future reviews? Long question there.
Yeah, another great question. Certainly what we heard from our participants is similar, that maybe the story is comprised of different segments, each from a different perspective, from the burn boss perspective, from the holding boss perspective. I'm not a decision maker in the process of either what the guidance will suggest, or on the it's the line officer who puts together that delegation of authority letter for a review team. Those two places would be, I think, keys for having that sort of discussion. I believe I saw just a week or so ago a new updated version of the FLA guide, and to be honest, that's on my list to read. So, but I think you're dead on in terms of looking, as we're vectoring towards learning, we have to move that direction. And what you're recognizing is people are all over that spectrum from compliance to learning. So figuring out where any particular group of people is and figuring out how to move them the next step towards learning is kind of the holy grail.
All right. Okay. All right. So last question. This comes from Dave Christensen. And Dave asks, since we are successful much more often than not, wouldn't there be a large number of positive lessons to learn from successful outcome reviews?
Potentially, yes. And I think that is in part, there were two reasons why people express the desire to look at good outcomes and not just at the bad and the ugly outcomes. One is for this very reason, that it's likely that we could learn some positive lessons from successful reviews, recognizing, of course, that it's only in hindsight that an outcome, we can deem an outcome positive or negative. In the moment, the thought process leading to one and leading to another may or may not give you much indication. What I found really interesting is that a lot of people talked about, on the emotional side, the intimidation and the angst that just the thought of a review raises in a whole bunch of different people. And a number of the participants said, well, isn't it likely that if we were better practiced at having reviews, that anxiety level would go down? That we were in a routine, sort of like an after-action review, but just maybe a little bit, instead of at a shift level at the burn level, maybe we'd get more in the habit and be more comfortable with really trying to understand where another person is, and build a culture in which we can ask another person, tell me, what were you thinking, what did it look like, all those sorts of things. And I thought that was really very interesting. So there's really at least two different reasons to look at successes. And one of them is this practice, getting better at figuring out how to do it well, do the review well. And the other is, let's capture some of the successes and figure out if we can replicate them again.
Okay. Well, Ann, I appreciate this. I think this is a really interesting webinar, and we look forward to, I know that you're going to be starting to write this up and publish a lot of this, and we look forward to all that that's coming out. And maybe we can get you back sometime for some more follow-up on this.
That sounds good. And anybody who has, specific questions or specific requests for how to present this data and make it useful to you all in the field, please contact me.
All right, and thanks everybody for coming to the webinar. I've put a link up where you can find the recording for the webinar. It should be up in about an hour, hopefully. And we'll see you, and then just one more time, mention the next webinar is March 7th, and you can find registration for that on the Advances in Fire Practice page. And again, thanks everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Thanks all.